Okay, this is part 10, the Synagogue of Satan, Footprints in History. I'll just continue with Constantine and his victory over Maxentius in the Civil War for the Roman Empire. Constantine finally triumphed at the battle for the Milvian Bridge, where he supposedly saw a sign that said that in that sign he would conquer and be victorious. But this is very likely a made-up story, and it was made to please both Christians and also those that worshipped Mithra. For the cult of Mithra, the cross was a sign for the sun, although it's sometimes said that this sign was a chi rho, which is a Christian symbol. Whatever, at about that time, the Roman Empire was about 50% nominally Christian. There had been the Edict of Toleration passed a few years before by Galerius, which ended persecutions on Christians, and when Constantine became emperor, he passed the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity and also further ended persecutions. It's often taught that Constantine legalized Christianity because his army had a large amount of Christians in it, but it's also believed that it may have been the army of Maxentius that had more Christians than Constantine's did. And it may be that Constantine was actually initiating the cult of Mithra into the Roman Empire rather than Christianity. His arch that he had built is full of symbols of Mithra and also the mystery schools. And it's interesting that if you look at the arch on the top, there are 8 figures which are believed to be 8 kings. And these kings all wear the Phrygian cap. And this is clearly a Mithraic symbol. And it's believed to be an ancient symbol of the authority of the emperor or the leader over vassal kings. And the Phrygian cap is a sign that they are underneath the power of that emperor and are subservient to him, and they're given all their freedoms as long as they wear the Phrygian cap and give their allegiance to the emperor. And if you remember, 8 is often the number of Marduk, so here we have 8 kings on the arch. Constantine himself was from the Balkans, of a family of obscure origins. It's interesting that the religion of Mithra was very strong in the Balkans, and also there was a strong Babylonian influence there. There are several questions you have to ask about Constantine. Did he really favor Christianity, or had Christianity become too strong for the empire, so a new plan was devised to mix Christianity with the religion of Mithra, to fuse the two religions and fool Christians into actually worshiping Mithra? By this time, most Christian churches were worshiping on Sunday, and the Sabbath had been changed from Saturday to Sunday. And since Sunday was the day of the sun, you might wonder if this was actually a move to make the Christian religion more like the Mithra religion and that of the mystery schools. Constantine also changed his capital. He moved it to Byzantium, which he renamed after himself. And this was done because he wanted to be closer to the richer parts of the empire and closer to the trade routes of the East. Constantine summoned the Council of Nicaea. I don't know if this was on his own or if it was at the council of others, but most reports claim that 318 bishops attended the council in 325 AD, and all of those bishops except 3 endorsed the doctrines of Athanasius, which upheld the Trinity, and only 3 upheld the doctrines of Arius, which were anti-Trinity. It's often taught that the Council of Nicaea was called to unify Christian doctrine, but was it actually called to understand just what Christians believed and what their doctrines were? Were they actually trying to find out Christian doctrine so that they could then subvert it? It's very interesting that the Trinity doctrine was almost unanimously accepted, but within a century, the doctrines of Arius, which were mostly rejected, actually almost took over the whole Roman Empire. About this time, important monasteries were being founded, especially in Egypt. There was a communal monastery founded by Pachomius around 320 AD. This was at Canoboskion in Egypt, and that name just means goose pasture. And this happens to be near Nag Hammadi, where a Gnostic library was discovered recently, going back to about that time. And there had been many hermits coming to the Egyptian deserts for centuries, going back to the Therapeutae and even to the Essenes. And they were related to another group called the Hermeticists. Like the Therapeutae, they were more pagan instead of Christian. They revered a figure called Hermes Trismegistus, and that name just means Hermes of the Three Majesties, or the thrice great Hermes. and that was related to the Greek god Hermes. And this was also connected to the Egyptian god Thoth, who was believed to be the same figure. And they practiced many arts like alchemy, which they believed had been passed down from Thoth and Hermes. There seems to be some confusion with the true meaning of the name hermit. We often think of hermits as people that dwell alone, and the standard derivation of the word is desert dweller or someone of the desert, and that's because many of them were found in desert regions like the deserts of Egypt. But the name hermit is also very close to hermeticist, and the confusion may be partly on purpose. The hermeticists may have wanted to conceal their true nature, and they wanted to keep hidden that they were practicing black arts or forbidden arts like alchemy and other practices going back to witchcraft. So the monasteries seem to have been a strange mixture of Christian and pagan elements, and also even Jews and sects with Gnostic beliefs. There's some speculation that many monasteries were actually founded by Syrophoenician citizens that had replaced the native Roman populations of the empire, and they may have been establishing monasteries as part of their trading networks, which they had actually had for centuries, even before the Roman Empire. One of these may have been the hermit Anthony, who was known to be very wealthy but of obscure origin. He was said to give his wealth to charity, but he may have had ulterior motives. He was very influential and drew many disciples to his communities in the deserts of Egypt. Many parts of the Roman Empire were being depopulated as real Romans or Latins were seeking more freedom in the countryside away from the Babylonian system that was prevailing in the large cities. There were certainly many disciples in the monasteries who were sincerely Christian of varying degree, but they may have been used by the founders of the monasteries for other purposes, possibly to conceal other doctrines and practices. There were many in the Christian church that began to suspect that the different sects were purposely causing division and strife in the church, like the growing Arian doctrines which they considered heresy. The Trinity doctrine or Nicene Creed finally prevailed over the doctrines of Arius with the actions of strong leaders like Ambrose. But no sooner was the Arian doctrine subdued than there was a civil war again in the empire. The war seemed to be between East and West. The Nicene Creed prevailed in the East, and paganism still prevailed in the West. The Emperor Theodosius I gave his support to the East, and the General Eugenius gave his support to the West. It's a bit confusing because General Eugenius and some of his supporters may have actually been Christian, but they had a large army of pagan Franks, and Theodosius had a large army of Goths who were mostly Arian Christians. Theodosius finally prevailed at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394 AD, but he lost much of his Gothic army. Much of the pagan Frank army actually fled the battle, and if you look closely, it appears that most of the people that died in the battles were actually Christians. It may be that Theodosius had set up the Goths to die in the worst fighting because they were Arian Christians, but they were not very learned or skilled in doctrines, and most of them seemed to have a sincere faith. Theodosius may have been only nominally a Nicene Christian or Trinitarian Christian. The motives of Theodosius are very questionable, and he seemed to be very superstitious. He had called in the hermit John of Lycopolis in Egypt to foretell the outcome of the last battle, and there's a story that there was a strange north wind that came down the Adpyram Pass by the river Frigidus, and the wind actually spooked the Frankish army that fled. And who knows, maybe the Frankish army were intending to flee all along, and this was all just a show to fool the Christians who died in the battles. Theodosius himself died only 4 months later in 395 AD, but he was successful in making the Nicene form of Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and he turned back the pagan factions of the West. It can be proven that it was actually the ruling classes and elite of Rome, many of whom were in the Roman Senate, that were behind trying to make paganism the official religion of the empire. And remember, many of those families were actually of Syrophoenician or Babylonian origin. What's even more interesting is that even though these senatorial families gave up trying to reinstate paganism, within just one generation, most of the popes came from these same families. It seems that these strange families finally decided not to try to destroy the Christian church from the outside, but to undermine it and to destroy it from within. At this time, Augustine of Hippo was creating several works which would be used to justify the Roman Catholic version of Christianity. Probably his most famous work, titled The City of God, was used to justify Rome being the central city that would govern the world. But the City of God almost certainly was just a modified form of Stoicism, and it argued for things like predestination and fatalism, as in Stoicism, and it argued the total depravity of man, which meant that men, because they were totally depraved, they needed a government, and they needed also a hierarchy of priests to show them the way to God. But many of his doctrines have actually been rejected by even the Roman Catholic Church. Augustine was also of obscure origin. It's not known exactly where his family came from. Some claim that they were partly Berbers and also partly Roman, but it's not certain. He was from Hippo in North Africa, and he may very well have been of Syro-Phoenician descent and even Babylonian descent. It's also very interesting that Augustine was very harsh on what he called heretics, and he wrote many works denouncing heretics. But why didn't he also denounce the Jews and consider them as heretics? He was actually very favorable to Jews and argued for toleration and that they would be allowed to thrive in Roman lands. He just argued to leave the Jews alone and that one day they would finally convert to Christianity. So I'll continue in the next part with the sack of Rome by the Goths and with the rise of the papacy in the Roman Catholic Church, and also the growing divide with Eastern forms of Christianity. So until next time.